Three Tommies sat in the trench one day discussing the war in the normal way. They talked of the mud, and they talked of the Hun, of what was to do and what had been done. They talked about rum. But the point which they argued from post back to pillar was whether Notts County could beat Aston Villa.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
But not all the United Kingdom was so united. In the early hours of Good Friday 1916, a man scrambled off a German U-boat into a small rubber dinghy, and then landed here at Banner Strand on the west coast of Ireland. He sucked in the fresh Irish air and gloried in the bird song, but not for long. Two officers of the Royal Irish Constabulary arrived. They'd had a tip-off about a German-sponsored revolt against British rule in Ireland. Quite right. In one of the man's pockets, they found the ticket stub for a railway journey from Berlin to one of the U-boat bases. The weary traveller was promptly arrested, charged with sabotage and treason, and taken to the Tower of London. The man was Sir Roger Casement, once a loyal servant of the British Empire. An Irishman, he'd become a determined critic of imperialism and joined forces with the Irish Republican movement. When war broke out, Casement decided that his enemy's enemy would be his friend. So he made his way to Berlin and spoke to the Kaiser's high command about using the German army and navy to help a full-scale Irish rebellion against the British Empire. In Dublin, the Republicans were also secretly asking for help from the Germans. And they resolved to proclaim a republic at Easter 1916. When Casement eventually heard about the plan, he went to the Germans to find out how they were going to help. From his point of view, the answer was bad news. 20,000 old rifles, but just enough ammunition for 2 or 3 days of heavy fighting, and above all, no German soldiers at all. This gave Casement a terrible dilemma. Either he'd come back and join a rebellion he knew was going to be a disaster, or he'd seem a coward. He decided to return to Ireland, but to plead with the rebel leaders to delay their uprising, and that was what he was doing here when he was arrested. In Dublin, the rebels decided to go ahead with the revolt, and on Easter Monday, they rose in rebellion. They occupied key buildings, including the General Post Office, and proclaimed Irish independence. But after the arrival of 20,000 British reinforcements, the rebellion collapsed in 5 days. It had been a small-scale revolt. Just 1,600 rebels compared to the 150,000 Irishmen who'd volunteered to fight for Britain in the war. The Irish, even in the Catholic South, still generally backed the British Empire. This general goodwill was about to be squandered by an act of brutal British stupidity. The police and the army rounded up 3,500 of the Irish nationalists, whether or not they'd been involved in the uprising. 97 of them were sentenced to death, 16 actually killed. 13 men died here, in one of the courtyards of Dublin's Kilmainham jail. A 14th, James Connolly, one of the leaders, was so badly injured that he had to be tied to a chair so that he could be killed there. These killings changed everything. In the words of one bishop, the blood seemed to be seeping out from under the prison door. They made martyrs of the rebels, and Irish opinion began to swing away from the empire and towards the Republican cause. In London, there was an influential campaign for clemency for Roger Casement. It was even supported by the King. But then, in a search of his rooms, the police discovered Casement's private diaries. They became known as the Black Diaries. Casement was a homosexual, and his Black Diaries listed and described his exploits with scores of young men. As soon as the diaries were in the hands of the British Secret Service, there was no chance of a reprieve, and Casement was duly hanged. His Irish cause, however, would smoulder and fizz all the way to civil war. On the Western Front, the war was descending into a nightmarish paralysis. It reached its bloodiest with the Somme offensive of July 1916. The idea was to destroy the German trenches with an intensive 7-day bombardment. British troops were told they'd be able to stroll through the shattered German lines and bring the war to an end. Many of the British troops were absolutely convinced of victory. Captain Billy Neville of the 8th East Surreys painted a football with the words, "Great European Cup Tie Final. East Surreys versus Bavarians. Kick off at 0. Another football was painted with the words, "No referee." And when the attack started, both were kicked over the top. Captain Neville offered a prize for the first British soldier to dribble one of the footballs to the German front line. When he led his men over the top, Captain Neville was killed instantly. So too were 21,000 other British soldiers, most of them within the first hour. German troops had survived the bombardment in concrete bunkers 10 meters underground. British infantry had walked into an inferno of machine gun fire. The generals have been blamed, callous, stupid, skulking behind the lines. Not quite fair. 78 British generals were killed in the war, and this was a totally new type of dug-in, industrialised slaughter. In 1916, nobody knew how to win this kind of war. But we're still left with the frightened young officers blowing their whistles and leading their men to death. Take Captain D.L. Martin of the 9th Devons. He'd been a maths teacher before the war, and he used trigonometry and scale models to prove conclusively that an agreed line of attack must end with him and his men being cut down by a particular German machine gun post. He showed his superior officers and was told, "Sorry, you must attack." Captain Martin and 160 of the Devons were killed instantly. They're buried together in a mass grave, above which is written, "The Devonshires held this trench. They hold it still."